journalism, and the entire
Oh
panel got
no!
stacked.
No!
The entire panel got stacked out by MRAs who were very confused.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Also, we're live, so
We live.
I'm gonna post the old link up on Facebook. Be like, come watch, guys.
Please hang out with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to restart the Twitch app on my phone, of course.
Like Twitch on your own devices all at the same time always ends up being really weird.
Yeah, it's like my phone is also not good at knowing when it's connected to the internet.
Phones are very sad.
It is very sad.
Also, hello everyone. Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing?
We here.
Hello.
I guess, well, I'll just quickly kick things off, shall I? Very awkwardly, as per usual. My name is Desney. Welcome to this Build-A-LARP panel. Today we're talking about ethics in LARP writing, so designing your LARP with ethics and such in mind. Yeah, I'm basically here to facilitate bringing all these wonderful peeps together. I have written and directed my own LARP, and known as The Hobbit's Hoedown, and I'm here with fantastic people such as...
Hayden Jones.
Go.
I have made and contributed to LARP and have been do LARP for more than a decade. It has been wild ride. Hello to you.
Amazing. Hello, I'm Mads Colvin. I've been LARPing for about 10 years. I started LARPing in New Zealand and then moved to Australia, which is where I'm based now. I'm an organizer for Swordcraft, Australia's biggest battle game. And prior to that, I was a game writer for Karuna's Plight. And I don't know, LARP is pretty cool.
Hi everyone, I'm Rob Anderson Hunt. My pronouns are he, him. I've been LARPing since the very first event that happened after I was of legal age to go LARPing, which is now a long time ago, and I'd prefer not to talk about that. I have run Zeppelin games, and I'm currently the lead writer for Black Powder and Bloodlines, a colonial LARP about conflict.
All of which are fine LARPs, by the way. Not to toot everyone's own horn for them, but Here we are. All right, cool. So, that being said, LARP is art, question mark?
Yes.
It sure is, Des.
Yes.
Okay, cool. I mean,
But what do you mean by art?
What I mean by art is, I guess, that something that is made to be indulged in, to sort of be appreciated, to be thoughtful. And as we have discussed previously in friendly conversation, art is deliberate.
Is this deja vu, or Rob, did we actually sit on a panel about this at PAX like 3 years ago? Did I imagine that?
Yes, you did not imagine that. This is, I ran a brief series of panels on exactly that topic about whether LARP can be art. And the answer was, hell yeah, LARP can be art, because art is about eliciting a response from people. And LARP is exactly that, like in one of its most pure forms. So I guess the topic that merits discussion is, how can LARP be art?
Well,
I guess it starts with, who's the artist, and is it the game writer, or is it the players you're working with, and who's actually meant to be the audience? Are people also the audience and the artist at the same time?
All of the above, I would say. Because, I've compared LARP to improv a lot over the years, because I came from improv and theatre and went into LARP. And, and this is one of the things when you talk about comedy and LARP, it's like, because comedy's easy to do, but the people you're making laugh are the audience. But in a LARP, the players are not only the performers, they're also the audience because everyone's there watching one another. So if in a LARP situation you're making people laugh, it'll be the other players. But also because the writers are, also artists, they're creating this setting and stuff, but they're also an audience because they are experientially, they are watching and seeing what the players are doing, and they are absorbing and taking that on board. So I would say both components or all components, like every human person within a LARP who contributes would be like, it would be very hard to contribute to a LARP and be therefore an artist and not also be audience to that LARP as well. So yeah, I would say that it would be extremely difficult to be one or the other and not both.
And in fact, even as a LARP organizer, like 80% of the time during play is spent watching the players do their wonderful thing. So even if one were to argue like the writers and organizers are the artist, they're also the audience too, like a big chunk of the time. So everyone at LARP is both an artist and an audience member.
Yeah, I think in a panel last week, I was saying something about parlor LARPs and how you have the ability to run the same game multiple times with the same characters and watch how it unfolds differently. So I think some really interesting stuff can happen there as well about, as a game writer, being the audience, basically creating a situation and just stepping back and seeing how it unfolds differently each time. I think that's, pretty cool.
I think there's definitely something to be said as well when we look back on sort of the concept of, you know what? It's left my brain and it's gone away. I was about to say something and I completely forgot it.
Was it one?
It was going to be really
panels?
smart.
It was going to be very smart. Sorry, what was that, Rob?
Was it one of the panels, Des, that you're thinking about?
Perhaps. The concept is gone. I don't know what happened to it.
Oh, well. Let's move on then.
Bye.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone for coming to our panel. Bye.
Yeah. Oh, God, I can't remember what it was. But perhaps I'll just quickly talk out of my arse instead. But yeah, no, those are really, really interesting concepts. I guess I came from a writing perspective when I came out of university, doing, English as most of my major, writing and things like that, being intensely interested in, as someone coming into the LARP scene, thinking, how interesting it would be that as a concept, for me as a player, I would be basically, there would only be so much that I could write up to a point. And then I'm just sort of reacting to everyone else's sort of like writing, I guess, because they are, joined with me in telling a story. They are collaborating with me as storytellers. There's only so much sort of like hardwired writing that we can do to sort of prepare ourselves for the chaos that ensues. That we, the idea that character development happens when there is an individual and then chaos of the story happens to the character, and then development comes from that, and it tells the unfolding of that story. And to do that on like off script and kind of do that with each other was such an intriguing thing or notion to me, or concept to be part of, because I thought, that's so fascinating. That's a different way of writing or storytelling that I'd never had really the chance to experience, and I thought was really, really enticing. And I think as LARP writers, this was the concept that I was going to say. The whole idea of we want to know what will happen. we are intensely interested in the chaos that we will put our players into, and what will unfold from that, and the lessons that we might come out of it with.
Yeah, very frequently for Black Powder, our team says we're reminding ourselves, we're writing and running to see what will happen. And it's really important as a LARP designer when you're creating your stories in general to write and run in order to see what will happen, because otherwise you're losing a lot of the ephemerality and the advantage of LARP as a medium, because it's about discovering things in the course of play, or at least the way that we use it a lot in our local environment is. I'm sure that there are others out there which have much more structured and railroaded narratives. I just realized I did air quotes, but the camera's not focusing on me, so I'm doing air quotes there if people can't see that. And it's worth having a think about how you, as a writer, when you're writing your game and when you're preparing for that chaos, it's worth considering what things you want your players to learn and how you want their characters to grow out of that chaos. There are lots of different ways to do it, and I'd love to hear the other panelists' opinion on that.
As in creating art from the chaos of, putting everything together at once, or?
Well, yeah, no, the chaos being the story which happens to the player characters, and how you, as a writer, can enact the topic sentence of this panel of getting across ethics and morals and lessons and themes and stories through your writing. I'm just trying to segue us back into the topic.
Well, I think sort of usually the easiest way to do that is to sort of if your players are approaching the game in such a way that the central theme is going to come up, then they're going to have to interact with it in some way, and they will always come to their own conclusion about it. And so the best you can do is sort of create a structure where the way they interact with the game at least shows them what it was you wanted to show them. So, if we take Black Powder as an example, one of the big themes is scarcity, and how scarcity can lead to antagonism between different groups of people. Because the mechanics sort of funnel people into, into competing over resources that they need for their characters to survive, at some stage, every player will need to think to themselves, assuming they want their character to survive, oh, I've got to get food. I've got to get food before the end of the game. And so if you have food scarcity, like you do, the players will be funneled into approaching the seeking of food. Obviously, trying to attain resources is easier when you're part of a group, but obviously different groups have different interests, so those groups of people are going to conflict. And this way, through the setup of the mechanics, you funneled players into experiencing this sort of, scarcity of resources creates antagonism and conflict between different groups of people, and if this pressure was taken away, it possibly wouldn't even exist. And there might be times when two groups with sort of differing aims might have cooperated, but now because there's scarcity, they've divided along that line. And so you haven't told the players that you want them to, deal with scarcity in the game. I mean, the actual design document does mention that it is part of it, but you haven't told them, you haven't railroaded them there, you haven't commanded them to do it. But you've created a structure that sort of funnels players towards that, dealing with that theme specifically. And I don't think Black Powder is just doing that, but I think it's a good example of the way a LARP can do that without having to force anyone to interact with it. Because if you didn't want to interact with that part of the game, you could choose not to. It's just that at the end, your character starves and dies. And that's fine. That's your choice. But
quickly, we also, I guess, kind of touched on this the last live stream that we did with Jack and Endrick, where we were talking about you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. The idea of mechanics sort of helping you to sort of point the direction. And yeah, you can't lead a horse to water, but you can make the ground sloped toward the water, and then you can make more water sort of more available to the horse by putting lots of buckets of water around. So it's really designing the surfaces of your LARP. And again, rules, they affect the player, and mechanics generally will affect the character. So it's really still a mode of storytelling, and I guess of what Hayden was saying was funneling your player base towards the ideas that you're trying to get across.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of different ways to do that. There is the I want to say obvious, again, scare quotes, the obvious mode of using mechanics, although that seems obvious to me because I'm at a certain point and that's the way I do things. But there are many, many ways to get theme across in your material. One of the ways that we have attempted, successfully or not, to get across the theme of colonialism in Black Powder is by using outdated colonialist, imperialist, and racist language in some of the reading material, so that people go, well, you can't call people heathens. And you go, well, in this game they do. And you acknowledging that you can't call people heathens because it's racist, because it's imperialist. That's a lesson that we deliberately want to get across. You can throw it in. You can the way that you write your material is in itself a mode of communication on top of the material content itself. The stories that you explore or don't explore in your game, they teach lessons as well. NPCs and the people who you choose to play NPCs can get across lessons as well. You can play with real world expectations on gender or race or sexuality by highlighting either adherence to those expectations or by highlighting variance from those expectations. There are lots and lots of tools that you as an organizer have to get across the messaging. And I know that one of the cool things that I've seen recently is Hobbit's Hoedown, because I know that they keep saying that their intent is to build a culture of family and a belonging almost to a radical extent through the way that they engage with their player base and involve them. Des, can you talk a bit to that?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess we felt that, I guess it's part of the mechanic of we want our player base to be more empowered to go out and have more social interaction, because this is supposed to be a very sort of fun and close-knit sort of feel to the whole kind of party. And we knew that it would feel like if people were a bit uncomfortable with each other, that perhaps the play wouldn't happen as organically and as enjoyably as we really envisioned for it to sort of take place. So from day dot, we were trying to cultivate people feeling more of a relationship with their kin. So putting up family bios, and then everyone sort of seeing personality traits or the vibes, I guess, of the energy of a family, to see what kind of family they'd like to be a part of, and then sort of being like, I really want to engage with that family, and then other players sort of seeing that and being like, yeah, I want to be a part of that family, and then commenting and sort of engaging with each other as well, saying you're I'm part of that kin, I relate to that. and we relate to each other, we're going to have a great time. And, you know, just starting to really bounce off each other and like hype each other up about being part of a family. And so from that point, there is a sense of belonging there that makes them excited to be part of a group. But also, when we feel like we belong in a space, we tend to be a little bit more outgoing. We feel safer to have social interaction, and we feel safer to make mistakes because there's no stakes. There's no wrong way to, you know, interact, other than, you know, obviously being completely horrible. But there was no space for that, because the space was so, I guess I want to say wholesome. And so really we wanted to impress that upon people, that it was about thinking about how you support, you know, other people in the scene with you, to not really worry too much what was going to happen to yourself, and to sort of trust that if you're doing the job of supporting other people in a scene, that they're going to do the same for you, because, you know, we're all trying to do that. So just trust that in a scene, if you're supporting others, it's likely that you're going to have a really, really great time because you're making other people feel good, and that the people who are in the scene with you are trying to make you feel good as well. And that in of itself is a mechanic, I should say. Hayden, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I think, and then as well, sort of, because we didn't sort of advertise much to people until kind of afterwards, that it was like, there is an ethical question here, or a thing like ethics was a big part of the design, but it wasn't something that we were like, hey, players, if you play this wrong, it's unethical. You're ruining it. But you know, that was sort of something about the game where we were like, yeah, like, you know, this is sort of predicated on the assumption that when people cooperate, that's how you get the best possible outcome, and that people will cooperate when you take pressure off, and then they did. And yeah, the game was constructed in a way that like players did that and showed that, and I like, if they weren't looking out for that being the conclusion, may not have consciously realized it, but I think it is still something a lot of people took away, is that, you know, they came away having had a good time because there wasn't a lot of pressure on them to do much of anything. And I know that there were some people there who had a good time with people that they hadn't really expected to. Where, you know, we had people interact for the first time who had known of one another from the LARP community but maybe hadn't played together before, or people who had like only really played in very competitive environments who suddenly played together and were like extremely cooperative with one another. And that was good to see because it sort of, you know, was getting to the core of what we wanted, but at the same time it also the way the culture of the game was set up meant that the players treated each other in a very good and kind way, which is a thing that you want even in a game where the setting and play is not like that. So,
Yeah, it's still definitely like one of those
Yes.
moments of that leading horse to water situation, of like, we're not saying that it's like a rule that you cannot, like, that you being an arsehole is just not allowed. It was more of an encouragement of like being a kind-hearted and supportive player makes you a better person, and it also makes you a better LARPer. And so we were basically trying to like more just like incentivize a push toward that kind of play and support of each other. So it wasn't like a rule of like, don't do this, but it was trying to be more of a like, our community is based on this.
yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that worked.
Says, Sorry, go ahead.
Just one of the things that worked really well about it was that it wasn't just about creating a safe environment where you wanted to do things because you weren't scared of failure. It was the fact that you didn't even have to try. Like even though there was this crazy ginger man telling me I had to play cricket, if I said no, it's not like he would go around and tell people that I was a bad person because I didn't want to play cricket. He'd just be like, okay, and that's it. And then you go harass someone else about playing cricket. So there was no shame in just saying, I don't want to do something. And I think that's pretty rare. I think a lot of games, there's a lot of pressure on you to either do everything because you want to experience everything or take risks because you want to push yourself. And I think that you end up taking a lot more risks when you almost when you know that you can just say, no, thank you. Thought, that was really cool.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And because it's one of the other things as well is, one of the other things is we had, when we were playing cricket, and just to use that as an example, we had, I know one of the players was like, we were like, yeah, go up and bat, because he'd been like, he was one of the people who really wanted to play cricket, but like, he was like, nah, I'm terrible, I'm garbage, I'm so bad. And it was like, we were all bad. None of us were good at batting. And then he got out there and was actually a better batsman than most of us, which is what I'd expected was going to be the case. Because none of us were very good, but also that was fine. Like, no one mocked anyone else for, having a go and then not doing a good job. And
it wasn't anyone's responsibility to be perfect.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, and most LARPs, to their credit, my experience has been like that. Like, people love it when you have a go, even if you don't do a good job. But there are some games or some experiences where I see people are encouraged to have a go, and then when they have a go and don't do a good job, they're punished for it by the people around them. And I don't think the people around them realize that's what's happening. But if you have a go at something that you were reluctant to try because you thought you were bad at it, and then you don't do a good job and other people make fun of you or punish you for doing a bad job, not only are you unlikely to try that thing again, you're unlikely to try something else you're not confident about as well. Because now that expectation is there, that, if I try something and I'm bad at it, people will punish me, and I don't want to be punished for being bad at a thing.
And that's full on happened to me at a game before. About 5 years ago, I went to a game in Canada, which it was very immersive. It was very good. It was a lot of fun role play. But at one point, the kind of person who I didn't know anyone in this game. I basically just messaged them on Facebook and was like, hey, I'm in the area. I'd love to come along. And they're kind enough to kind of accommodate me and give me someone to help me through the game. But it was one of those games where there was no kind of like moose hands out of character questions. It was like, no, this is hardcore in character all the time. Which at the time I thought was great. But looking back, there's a point where we were at the archery range and my friend was saying like, oh, come on, give it a go. And I was like, oh, I've never tried archery before. I don't really want to give it a go. At the time, I was pretty unfit too. Like, I was just not feeling very confident about it. I think I was having medical issues at the time too. And I was like, I just don't want to. And he was like, oh, come on, give it a go. And I was like, I really don't want to. I was trying to communicate in character, out of character. I was like, I really don't want to do this. And it just wasn't happening. So finally, I was like, fine, give me the bow and arrow. And I tried to shoot an arrow, and I'd never done it before. And it basically, I'm sure everyone's done it, where you shoot it and it just kind of falls off the bow. And it hit the ground. Everyone laughed at me, and and it was kind of like, wow, this is not a wholesome experience. And
that sounds terrible.
And at the time too, I was really struggling with kind of self-confidence, and I was just trying to be good at everything. And then it was just put so plainly in front of me that I was not good at archery. And it was just, I didn't try archery for another 3 or 4 years until I decided I was going to do it because I wanted to kind of overcome that confidence issue and try something I was bad at. Like, once I finally started to have the confidence to do things I was bad at, and the fact that they created that environment where, everyone was role playing and they're like, oh, of course my character would laugh at you. They're an archery champion and you're shit. It's like, okay, fair enough. But that stopped me from wanting to use that kind of weapon for years. And it's just, at the time I was like, oh, hardcore roleplay made me feel bad things. And then looking back, I'm like, no, bad people made me feel bad things.
Yeah. I think I'll just quickly touch on something that has been said in the chat by Faye Gamerboy. One of my favorite parts, that was one of my favorite parts of the family, is for the most part, we weren't with people we already knew well. The culture created a really lovely space to get to know and support people that you might not have interacted with properly before. I guess, I mean, when we talk about like the social interaction, it's not just like getting our players to get to know each other or anything like that. Whilst, we do want them to get to know each other, it's more of a, like, we're trying to get the mechanics to encourage the players to interact with our game. And the game setting is a party. So it's a social activity, so they need to interact socially. And in Madeline's case, it was an attempt to get them to Madeline to interact with the game, but in a very forceful way that wasn't enjoyable. It didn't actually allow for mistakes, and it didn't allow for a joyful experience, and it sounds a little bit traumatic, to be honest.
Character building, you know.
Yeah, but I think that it's really important that what we are trying to create is a space, that we are sort of creating a framework for our players to explore the interactive side of that game. And Josiah's just said here, in terms of an ethic here, I'm curious about ethical responsibilities. I'm wondering if you can distill, in light of this conversation, some ethics re player responsibilities to each other. And are these different from LARP to LARP?
I think that that's a long conversation, which isn't unfortunately related so much to the Build-A-LARP panel series, because it's more of like what players would do. But flowing on from that, there is a very strong element of writer and organizer responsibility in building a culture where players aren't dickheads to each other. I think that Mads has highlighted one of the pitfalls of writing and running a game which is 100% in character, because you have an entire game of people who will just say, yeah, but my character would do that. That's what my character would do. Yeah, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, knife you all and steal your treasure and leave because I'm a rogue. That's what rogues do. Without really strong guidance, that actually creates a lot of problems. Personally, and while that's something that you want to discuss on your sliders and your faders on your mixing board in the first place, it's worth keeping in mind that as an organizer, your first responsibility is the well-being of your players, both physical and mental. And if you're going to have a 100% in-character game, you need to have signaling or workshopping or training to ensure that people don't make people do stuff without their consent, like force them to participate in an archery competition that they clearly don't want to participate in. Because that's a relatively harmless example of that, but there are some really, really bad places that can go. So it's really vital to accommodate all of the game decisions that you make with relevant safety decisions too, for a really intense freeform or parlor LARP game. It's very important to have, for example, a debrief, like a half hour, put it at least half hour for 3 hours set aside at the end of the game for everyone to sit around and talk about their feelings and decompress, and laugh about that thing that they did 40 minutes ago, which was awful then, and now it's hilarious, or apologize for that thing that they said, or all of that. It's important that organizers make safety and well-being decisions, and because those will not only be like directly beneficial for players, but they'll also be picked up in the cultural cues which your game has. I see Hayden nodding. Hayden?
Yeah, I think because I think one of the things about running and organizing a LARP is because regardless of how much writing goes in, you're still responsible for the creation of the play space. And as the people responsible for the creation of the play space, you will always have some degree of power over those within that space. And, you know, obviously, when you have power over a person, you need to exercise that responsibly. And part of that is ensuring that the people within the space are safe from harm or from damage. So not only is it important to make sure that you as the organizers and writers are respecting the agency of the human beings who are playing characters within that space and respecting the well-being of the human beings of the characters within that space, it's important to set the expectations for the players that they need to ensure that of one another as well. Because I personally am of the belief that it's not enough to just do no harm, that you also should aim to do kindness as well. Like, you shouldn't just be a neutral actor that, you know, doesn't harm anyone else. You should try and be supporting and kind where you can. But part of that is when you as an organizer or a writer are creating a game and you're inviting players to come and take part in this game, and, you know, you among your writing staff and organizing staff know, hey, we're going to be good to our players. You know, say, for example, this game is extremely cutthroat. The characters are extremely cutthroat. It's going to be ruthless. It's going to be very difficult for the characters. It's going to be a very stressful space. So obviously there's the fact that it will also be stressful for players, and we need to make sure that the players aren't damaged by this experience. You also need to make sure that the players themselves know that and expect that of one another and are there for one another, because there'll be some times where your organizers and writers can't be everywhere. You can't be observing everything at once. And so you need to be able to trust and rely on your players to be good to the human beings that they are, so that, you know, you don't have two players go off and have a role play experience that's incredibly harmful to one or both of them, and then find out about it later and not have been able to intervene in that. You want to be able to let those players go off and do that thing and come away from it and be like, ooh, that was difficult, but I went into it knowing that ahead of time. I trusted the other player, that player trusted me, and we were able to be there for one another. So I'd say there is a degree of control and expectation setting that the writers and organizers can do is the ones with the most power within that play space. But I think definitely there is a greater onus on the writers and organizers themselves to do that, because they are the ones with more power, and the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to use that power well.
Yeah, and I think that LARP as a business model, or as an immersive game, it's uniquely so close to emotional exploration. We explore emotional themes like love. We explore trauma, PTSD. We normally explore death as well, and the grief that comes from that, and how it affects others, how it affects the person who's died, and the way that we process those emotions. And those are very heavy topics to explore as in real life, and to have the ability to explore them through storytelling, and as it's happening to us, because it happens when we play, it happens to us. It can be hard to put up, that glass and be able to observe it from the outside, but you need to be able to facilitate, your players being able to be given that space to then put up that glass, sort of distance themselves from that emotion a little bit, be able to process the emotions of that, to be able to also, like, as Hayden was saying, treat each other kindly within those scenes, even if they are supposed to be like mortal enemies or something like that, but that they are exploring those themes, those emotions, in a safe environment. That the trauma of what is happening to that scene is not real, or it's not true. Rather, it's not true, but it is real to the players that it's happening to, and there does need to be, I guess, mechanisms and sort of design in your game to be able to help support your players to feel like they can actually explore those ideas and those themes, which are important, by the way, so that they can do that to the best of their abilities, knowing that they're going to be safe and knowing that other people in their community are going to be supportive of that play.
Yeah. And I think something as well with that is, and this might be sort of getting too much into the weeds, is so I think I'm going to use Black Powder as an example here because I think it is a good one. So Black Powder obviously explores racism and colonialism, and so my character is a colonizer. They have racist views, but I've tried to keep it like casual racism, because even though most of the players playing the Uruks are white and probably haven't experienced structural or systemic racism within their lifetimes, I don't know a lot of them, and I don't want to be racist to them if I'm not sure how they're going to respond to it. So I try and, keep it very much, this is obviously an in-game thing I'm doing. But one of the other issues there is, within that game, or within other games, because LARP is a broad church, and within the community, even in Victoria, there are people who, outside of the games, in their real lives, are genuinely racist and are genuinely misogynist. And so, if I see someone like Destiny being racist in the setting of Black Powder and Bloodlines, I'm like, oh, okay, I know Destiny understands structural and systemic racism. This is a part of her character. But if I see someone doing that, being racist in character in the game, but I also know they're racist out of the game, then I'm like, I don't know if you're doing this in character or you are using this character as an excuse to indulge racism you genuinely feel toward real human beings in your real life, but it's not socially acceptable for you to indulge it in that space. And that also does apply to you as an organizer and a writer. Like, your own personal politics will be examined by the people who want to play your game. And if your game involves some form of, like, if your game involves the portrayal of bigotry and you yourself are bigoted, people aren't going to, and I mean, you might not think you're bigoted, but like, people are going to look at that and say, is this game for exploring bigotry through its portrayal, or is this game a chance for you to indulge your bigotry and allow other players to indulge that bigotry as well? Because that also is a degree of trust. Because, even, for example, if you had myself and Rob, we wrote a game where, like, me and Rob, we're going to explore systemic sexism. We're going to explore what it's like to experience that on a very structural, systemic level. It's me and Rob, we're working together. And, people look at that and be like, Rob and Hayden, both very good, very woke boys, they understand it, but neither of them have ever personally experienced that, so I don't trust them to know what the fuck they're talking about. Why would I play a game about sexism that's been written by two dudes? And so even if Rob and myself are well-intentioned and we've written a good game, and it is really good, like, that outward perception is still going to affect that. But that's also something that, like, you have a responsibility as a writer and organizer to do it properly. And a lot of the time, if you want to explore something like that, the best way to do it properly is to consult the people who are affected by the thing you want to explore. And, in this hypothetical case, it would be something where you'd want to include people in the organizational and writing process who understand that structure, not only from the outside, but also from having been affected by it.
Madeline, did you want to go?
Yeah, well, I guess when I wrote Chesterwick, which was a game within a game, basically. It's a warband at Swordcraft. I wrote it at a time when Swordcraft didn't really have much story, so I basically said, I'm going to write my own LARP and run it at this LARP with my members. So Chesterwick had a whole internal story, and the whole thing I was trying to explore with it was the fact that nice people aren't necessarily good people. So Chesterwick was very much based around 14th century England. I brought in a lot of that kind of, that sexism that you would have had back then, the idea that women couldn't be thought leaders, that, women couldn't really be in charge. And it was a little bit tongue in cheek because they were basically led by a woman. But the two main characters for it, the Duchess, who I played, and the prince, whom my husband played, were NPCs. I wrote them a story arc that lasted like 3 to 5 years that would have happened at Swordcraft, and I wrote the characters in their entirety. And basically, I took Prince Gilderoy, who was our illustrious figurehead, and I gave it to Kieran. And I said, Kieran, this is the character that you're going to play. And Prince Gilderoy was a lovely man, incredibly sexist, quite charming, and the whole point of him was it was supposed to be confronting that such a lovely, charismatic person could also be so horrifically sexist and borderline racist a lot of the time. And I was kind of inspired by the fact that we all have that racist uncle at Christmas, and the rest of the family goes, oh, but it's fine. He's a nice guy. Just let him run his mouth for 5 minutes. Don't argue, and we'll just all turn a blind eye to it. And I wanted it to be confronting that this nice public person was such an asshole. And I actually had someone come to me in private and who didn't know Kieran, my husband, very well, and say that they had a big problem with him, and they had a big problem with the character he was playing, and they thought it was really inappropriate that Kieran had written himself this horrible sexist character, and they felt like he was playing out all of his awful sexist fantasies because, he was able to belittle me in front of people by being like, shut up, wife, and stuff like that. And I kind of let them talk to me about their worries because, it's a legitimate worry, like the kind of hypothetical situation you've just outlined, Hayden, like that, like people can kind of write LARPs as like, a masturbatory experience in pursuing something that isn't really appropriate in modern day society. So, I did kind of entertain the notion that like, oh, maybe Kieran's this horrible person because he's choosing to play this awful character. And then I was like, well, actually, Kieran isn't playing a character he wrote. He's playing a character that I wrote. And every night we get together and we talk about Prince Gilderoy and we talk about what he did during the day. And basically I decide what he's going to do the next day. And Kieran is an actor who's playing that NPC for me. And it completely changed their perception of that character because all of a sudden it went from here's a white dude getting to tell his wife to shut up all the time because he probably doesn't get to do that in real life very often. And then it turned into, here's this character who's actually a social commentary on the fact that we're comfortable with this because despite someone coming to me in private, over the course of this whole story arc, no one actually ever called him out publicly, ever. No one ever said, well, Gilderoy, that's an awful thing to say. No one said, like, shut up, you bigot. Everyone let him run his mouth. They let him belittle me. They let him do whatever he wanted because he was lovely and charming and no one wanted to rock the boat. So I feel like, the whole point was absolutely made in that respect. But the authorship of that character did drastically change people's perception of him once they found out that I'd actually written him and it wasn't just, Kieran being an asshole.
Yeah, there is a huge risk of pose law coming into play where you can't tell what's satire or author intent and what's genuine in LARP because it's such a potentially such a subtle storytelling medium. It's all because of the layers that a performance has to go through before it actually gets to the players, from like concept to writer to NPC brief to the NPC to the actual on the day portrayal of that NPC. There are so many layers that it can go through that author intent is really, as a string, it doesn't follow a direct line to get to the players' heads. I think that's why that happens. But that's definitely something that I've experienced multiple times at multiple different LARPs, where the the message, the story, it's pretty important to make it right up front and center. It turns out that when we were running Zeppelin, one of the stories we were trying to tell was the story of this coal mining company discovering a new source of energy and then turning that into a power plant and then renewing this almost post-apocalyptic society into a more powerful, cooler, steampunk, post-industrial revolution nation, making them more powerful, more awesome, more cool. They were in like beat for beat, story aspect for story aspect, like Wayland Yutani from like the Aliens series. They were a terrible, corrupt, exploitative, violent, awful corporation. And throughout the game, players kept siding with them because they're like, well, what are you talking about? They're trying to create a new frontier. They're exploring this new method of creating energy, which will be clean and safe. And we're like, no, look, here's the diagram for the engine. You see this bit where it says nuclear catastrophe? Oh god, players, why? Like, whether it's because of those layers that the story has to go through, or just because players be players, it's important that the messaging in your story as a writer actually be a little bit less subtle than you'd like it to be a lot of the time. It's important that it be clear. It's one of the reasons why like the Black Powder stuff all has, this is a game about colonialism and conflict, because even though we put in these rules and situations where colonialism and conflict are at the forefront, people keep trying to cooperate. And we're like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. The game will go away if you all work together. People are out there trying to be nice to the Uruk when they're playing colonizing white people. It's like, no, white people bad, colonies bad, imperialism bad. Stop being nice to the Uruk. It's not how it. Yeah, but like it's important that you get out the mallet and you have your corporation like abduct people in the middle of the night and turn them into automata and then shell the peaceful town. Like, if you need to kick the dog, you kick the dog really, really hard. Presuming you're writing a game which has villain, like if your subtle villainous build-up is almost certainly going to be too subtle. Your subtle thematic build-up is almost certainly going to be too subtle. Otherwise, you'll have people who, like the one Mads is talking about, who's come up and said, I think Kieran is an awful sexist person. You should break up with him, or whatever it is they said. Because they weren't sure of that authorship, because they weren't sure where they couldn't tell that what they were saying was intended to be a thematic commentary or a challenge. There are so many layers that players have to get through to figure that out. It's important that you like ramp it up.
And I think something that as game writers, LARP writers, we kind of take for granted or occasionally forget is that when we're looking at cinema studies or literary studies or any of those mediums, people have so much time to pour through the literature, to rewatch that scene, to get all those subtle nuances out of what they're looking at. Whereas everything in LARP is like the snap of a finger and it's over, and you don't have time between each scene. I mean, unless you're just doing a series of short parlor LARPs where you're doing debriefs after every single one and you're talking through every single scene. Like at Black Powder, something happens and then you react instantly. You don't have time to sit there and dissect it and be like, oh, so what's the symbolism here? What could they possibly be foreshadowing? I mean, you always have that going on in the back of your head, kind of as just a meta stream as a player to some point. Like, unless you're just trying to play the game and have fun, which is also A-okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you don't have time to sit there and pull apart this beautiful, intricate narrative and dissect every single word like you would with other mediums.
Yeah, criticism takes time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that's why it is so important to try as much as possible to design and cultivate your player community, because you need to have a community that reacts on the fly well. And by well, I don't mean perfectly. Again, it's that the idea of like the well-played game, that we are there to be fully engaged. We are there to be to be interacting on an I guess probably like again for just play, but on a level that is intended to be exploration rather than just being completely terrible to each other. But yeah, I think that when we are crafting our messages in LARPs, and we do hit those ethical dilemmas, it can bring rise to the stakes, and you need to sort of help to really equip your players with the tools as much as possible as game writers, to really help them to explore those things. Does anyone have any sort of, I guess, examples of how you might craft an ethical message into a LARP game that has quite high stakes?
Well, so
Robert.
No, go ahead.
Robert?
All right.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead first.
All right. Yeah. Well, I think this ties into a thing of portrayal versus like explanation or prescription. But I think that say for example, you want to play a game where you explore like I know when myself, you and Destiny were sort of writing the Buffy LARP, one of the things we wanted to explore is how trauma or unhealthy relationships can affect how you treat other people and stuff like that. And that's obviously a very difficult and fraught subject, but also a subject that a lot of players will have very personal experience with. And I think there is merit in exploring that idea, but it is super easy to explore that idea in a bad and dangerous way that is not good for your players. So just sort of to take that one as an example, if you were to have a game where it's like, okay, players within this environment, like some of you may have some underlying trauma or something like that causes you to sort of behave in a toxic or unpleasant way to the other people around you. But this game is about you developing and learning as a person to improve. That will necessitate those kinds of toxic and destructive behaviors that people in the play space will themselves have personal experience with. And that is something that a lot of people have a very negative involuntary reaction to. And so if you were going to do that, and again, I do believe there is merit in having games that do explore those kinds of things, you need to let people know well ahead of time that that is one of the aims of the game and that you will be exploring that, and that you need to have the players be equipped enough to explore those things in a way that's safe. Because, as Madeline mentioned, one of the things with LARP is because it's so improvisational and you're sort of doing it on the fly is like, going all the way back to when I was doing improvisation, in high school on a sort of competitive level, I would never remember afterwards what I'd done. I'd remember 2 or 3 things out of an hour-long session, and that would be like, my memory of what I'd done would be about 45 seconds long from 60 minutes, because the amount of brain I usually have to remember stuff while I'm doing it was taken up by trying to think on my feet. And when people are thinking on their feet, one of the problems you'll have, especially in a high-stress situation, is you'll default back to this like basic axioms or basic socialization. And especially because all of us have been raised, sort of within Western, like, capitalist liberal democracy, a lot of the socialization we've been brought up with is that people must always be productive, competition produces the best outcomes, within a free system where people are competing with each other, the best service always provides. And, like, there's always this pressure to be productive and competitive and like hustling and stuff like that, even if we don't want things to be that way. And so you'll see times when under that kind of high stress or under that kind of in that moment, people will sort of be like, I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm not going to shake up the system because I need to think about my own best interests and I need to make the decision that serves me in this moment. And so, yeah, you do end up having players. Players can often end up behaving in selfish ways because they don't have time to think about what they're really doing. And if you have a situation where you're combining that with, hey, we're going to be dealing with some stuff that's potentially traumatic for some of you, you need to make sure that's done in a way that the players experiencing that understand what's going on, because even in the most, like, the best prepared player base, the possibility for accidents or inadvertent mishaps is there, and it needs to be something that your players are prepared for, are aware that it could happen, and when it does happen, or if it does happen, are able to, know sort of, they all have an understanding of what to do. So, like, it's like, hey, guys, we're exploring some traumatic stuff or stuff that's potentially traumatic for some of you. If something does go wrong or someone is hurt, like whether it be physically or emotionally, like if someone's well-being is at risk, this is the protocol you're all to undertake. And, they all know how to do that, but also just being like, hey, you're here to respect each other, and while we are exploring these things, they affect some people more so than others. Even without realizing, your behavior can have a negative impact on others. Just be mindful of that as you play, and if you do need to take a moment to step back and have a look at what you're doing in the moment, it's better to do that than try and stay in the moment and role play as effectively as possible. Because it seems to be in those situations where people are like, I've got to stay in character because that's how you role play. The best role play comes when you're in character all the time. That's when a lot of those really bad things happen. And it's why there are so many stories of like fucking dickhead method actors being complete shits to the rest of the cast of the project they're working on.
Absolutely. I'll just point out very quickly that Joe is writing that LARP with us, not Rob.
What LARP?
Oh, no, I didn't mention Rob as the... No, I didn't. I don't think I mentioned that Rob was writing it.
I am currently not working on any LARP with Des and Hayden.
Yeah, I don't...
Yeah, no.
Did I say
you
that?
You said you, Des, and I.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, yes, sorry.
This fact makes me a little bit sad now, particularly, but, it's fine.
It's okay, Rob. We could write a LARP together.
Yeah.
Yeah. I look forward to it. It'll be very great, I'm sure.
Did you have more to say on that, Hayden, or was it my turn?
I think it's your turn, Rob.
Okay, cool. I wanted to answer your question, Des, in a very direct fashion, like a time when you used an in-game event or story to try and tell a lesson.
Yeah.
So the one that comes to mind for me was during Zeppelin. One of the things we had a group of characters who were playing a slightly different game to everyone else, where they got to be basically pirates, and they were like trying to do a bunch of pirate tasks to become pirate kings, having their own awesome little private story involved with one of the different nations outside the main one. And one of the things that we gave them was that we wanted to give them was, slavery is bad, but here is why people do it. So what we did was we said, here is a fuck ton of money. Go to this place, pick up some goods, go to the other place, receive the money, drop off the goods. They got there, the goods were people. They then had to spend a good 20-30 minutes escorting this group of chained, passive, sad, despondent, etc. slaves from the pickup to the drop-off. They engaged with the slaves. They tried to have feelings. They even stopped every time they tried to talk with the slaves would just go, oh, Just make a sad noise. Very sad. And they even stopped the convoy to discuss whether what they were doing was ethically right. And then in the end, they said, well, it's a shitload of money and we need to save the world. So they sold some slaves. But the point of that exercise was to say that you guys have the choice to do good things and bad things, and there's always an opportunity cost, and sometimes the right thing is not the easy thing, and sometimes the hardest thing is the morally right thing. And what's really, really important is that as a LARP writer, you remember that portrayal is not the same thing as endorsement. And because otherwise you can't tell any valuable stories. Well, you can't tell anything like that. You can't give perspective into why bad things happen. You can't give perspective into why people do bad things unless you're going to show those things.
And I think it's also important to give the choice for those things as well.
Yes,
like player choice.
It's like, here are the steps which lead to someone making that choice which is morally wrong. Would you do the same thing? Would you do a different thing? Why would you do a different thing? Is it because your circumstances are different? I wonder. Is that maybe because you live in a country where it's not so necessary for you to have that kind of money that you need to save the world and all this sort of thing? It's important to like not do bad stuff and not endorse bad stuff. But there's a lot of bad stuff that you can't explore in a game without just saying, this is bad. Done. The capability for players to go through the decision tree and go, so that's why that happens. I need to work on the root causes of these problems to be able to make any changes like this in the real world, I think is really, really important. And it's something that I get really, really angry about when people are like, they show Nazis, therefore they say Nazis are good. You can't say Nazis are bad without saying Nazi. It makes me... Anyway, what's important as a writer is that you make every effort that you can to be contextually just when you're portraying bad things. That you say, okay, so how can I do justice to this problem? I understand that I am white. I understand that in racial relationships, the vast majority of the time, people who look like me are the bad guy. I understand that in imperialism, particularly as a person of British ancestry, I'm the bad guy, like the worst colonialists. Except maybe Belgium. But anyway, it's important that you check your privilege, that you explore all the relationships that you have to the topic, and then find the best way to be just. Often it will be consulting with people who are affected by whatever the topic is. Women for sexism, trans people for transphobia, lower class people for economic struggle, etc. But at the end of the day, you are writing a game, and it is important to, in the spirit of the well-played game, just do the best you can. So if something is tangential, like it is a tangential issue that comes up, do it as justice as you can, acknowledge any injustice that you may do, and move on. It is okay to fuck up, because you don't get anywhere unless you try to do things.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to sort of give, in your space of storytelling, if you are trying to get across a point, that you're not forcing your players to be like, look, slavery is bad.
Yeah, not like holding the dog's face to the poop and going, you're a bad dog, you pooed, you did bad. Go, well, this poo that is in your dog bowl, that's not good food, right? So I'm not going to feed you. Like, yeah, it's important that the message be more subtle, but also not too subtle. Sorry, go keep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's you've gotta show people. You've got to show, not tell, which is basics of writing.
Oh, I know I apologize for interrupting, but I'm going to interrupt again already, because a particular thing about, like, there's also no point preaching to the converted. Otherwise, you just, like, doing a happy echo chamber love-in, right? Unless there are people who have lessons to learn about, say, racism, there's no point doing a LARP about racism because everyone already knows that racism is bad, so we don't do racism. Except obviously, it's impossible to be perfectly not racist, so everyone has something to learn about racism. But like, yes, it is very, very important that you, as a LARP organizer, pick out and remove the people who are using your game as an excuse to do evil as a masturbatory fantasy. But also, if all of the people there already understand the lessons, then it's also masturbatory. It's just, circular rather than personal.
Yeah, I agree with that. Why it's
Great.
good to challenge liberal democracy.
I'll quickly just point out Josiah's wonderful comment. Mad's point here is so interesting to me. I've been reading a lot of digital game studies that analyzes work similarly to cinema and literature, scene analysis, etc., but comes up against the problem of what do the players take away from this? E.g., if I play Age of Empires, am I colluding in an ideology of imperialism as a player? Or am I a critical player able to consider the imperial histories as I play, etc.?
Yeah, I was like glancing down at Josiah's comment there as I was ranting before. Like, basically, portrayal is not endorsement. The end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
particularly accurate portrayal. Like, if you just say this is as close as we possibly understand what happened, have a look and draw your own conclusions. I personally feel that is absolutely morally okay.
And I think I was going to say that,
Sorry,
like, in terms of those stories, I guess it's really important to note emotionality as a drive sometimes for those choices in those ethical sort of questions when it is played out. So after the fall, for example, played out the whole immigration or refugee sort of ethics and story, I guess. The first night that I was ever playing after the fall as Danny May was, a very strange experience because I think at the time we were in some sort of height of talking about in Australia's sort of social commentary or our what we were going through as a nation was boat people. I think we were going through the height of the Abbott prime ministership, and so boat people and refugees and the opening of Manus Island and all that sort of stuff was at the forefront of the conversation in Australia's mainstream. So when it came to experiencing after the fall, for me, I've already been sort of at the other side, like been at the, I guess, receiving end of that racism because of, how Pauline Hanson was like, Asians are flooding Australia and all that sort of stuff. And I could never really get behind the emotion of it. Like, how could someone so readily just want to be so terrible towards an entire group of people who've been misplaced, and really are not in the situation that they're in because they are like, oh, you know what? I'll just pop over to Australia. They wanted to be home. They wanted to build a life. They wanted to have a family. They had hopes and dreams, and they really needed to be in a place in which they have to go. They have to pack up and leave, and it has to be dire. So it really confused me why people weren't really relating to that idea, and therefore people would just be so aggressively against boat people. It confused me. So when that first night after the fall came round, and there was, it was dark, it was night, there were a bunch of refugees that were banging on the doors or the gates of Sanctuary, and we had kind of collectively as a group or as a town decided that we weren't going to let them in because everything was so scarce. And we were worried that we didn't know these people. We didn't really have enough resources to go around. And if we were to choose them or our loved ones, we would choose our loved ones. And the emotionality of feeling like I'm making this decision not because I'm trying to be terrible towards these people, but I am scared for the safety of the people that I know and love, and the community that I reside in. Knowing the emotionality behind that and sort of exploring that, even though I obviously do not endorse the vilification of refugees, because, I come from a refugee family, it was still like, oh, this emotion makes sense. This feeling of uncertainty, this feeling of scarcity, of anxiousness, the anxiety of wondering what's going to happen if I do let them in, what happens to the people that I know, that I love, the emotionality of that completely makes sense. And so we ended up making, I guess, ethically not very sound decisions to not help the refugees on the other side of that gate, because the emotional impact of that decision was quite great, and also completely understandable and completely explainable, even if it was a difficult one to make.
Something I would like to touch on there as well, actually, is because that's actually what I wanted to talk about, but you now talking about that sort of gives me a better example to go off, is so one of the things you need to be careful of when you're trying to do these kinds of things is what After the Fall was portraying there is fundamentally the conservative view of how immigration works. Because a lot of the conservative fear of refugees is based upon this false premise that there is scarcity and that we need to control the incoming population because if we let them in, there won't be enough for everyone. Now, that idea is patently false, and a lot of the racists in Parliament who peddle that idea know that. So, for example, the LNP, who were the ones trying to prevent asylum seekers arriving by boat, also opened up the way for more international students to come over. So they actually increased the number of immigrants coming over, but the ones they prioritized were the ones who make the Australian economy more money. So the only reason they vilified people coming over by boat was because it's a political issue they knew they could whip up to make people who don't know enough about politics or don't know enough about Australia afraid enough to vote for them. And so what that was doing is it wasn't showing people who were already racist and afraid of refugees that they were wrong. It was showing people like yourself how conservatives see the world and how they think, because that's what it was portraying. I don't know if that was the intention of the game designers, because that situation is based on an inherently Malthusian idea of the world that the planet doesn't have enough resources for all its people, let alone even more people arriving, which again is factually untrue. And so this is one of the issues you need to take care of when you are trying to portray these things, because I agree with Rob that portrayal is not an endorsement, but the way you portray something can inadvertently reinforce the idea you're trying to reject. And this is where we come into that problem, because fundamentally, in the real world, there is no scarcity crisis in Australia in terms of the resources we have available for refugees. We could let in every single person who arrived by boat to this country and not have to worry about resource scarcity, because fundamentally the scarcity in Australia is down to artificial scarcity because of the distribution of wealth and resources. However, in a post-apocalyptic setting, scarcity is very real because it's a post-apocalyptic setting. And so in that case, you are actually, if you do let in these outsiders, there won't actually be enough for every single person, which was how the game was set up. But that gives insight into the way that a lot of social conservatives think, because they already believe that to be the case, which is why they're fine with, for example, people dying from lack of healthcare, lack of housing, or lack of food, because they already don't think there's enough to go around. And, there will have been conservative players at that game who are like, this is what I'm trying to tell everyone. This is exactly what's happening now. This is why we can't let in the boat people. Because there's not enough to go around. And because at that game, I was one of the NPCs. So I was on the other side. I was, we were the people who were portraying those refugees, or portraying people from within the town who weren't aligned with any one of the factions. And a lot of people were like, wow, I was treated really poorly, and I did not have a good time, and that really sucked, and I do not like the player base, and there was an element of antagonism between the NPCs and the player base, because the cruelty of the player base towards these outsiders felt like it was more than just the characters themselves portraying it. It did at times to some of the NPCs feel as though people who already were who in their real everyday lives were already afraid of refugees were using the game as a way to sort of indulge this fear of refugees on other people. And that did not make them feel good. And so if you are going to portray something in your game that you want to critique, or you want people to think about more deeply, you need to portray it in a way that doesn't inadvertently contribute to the other position. And especially when it comes to stuff like refugees or environmentalism, and this is a really common one with the environment, is all too often scarcity is portrayed as a problem that exists in the current world today, and it's just not the case. The real problem is distribution of resources, not availability of resources. That's sort of the major point I wanted to make there.
So, in terms of giving your players the tools to interpret the stories that you're telling, it is, as Hayden says, it's really important to ensure that they get the right message and that they can move forward from that. And how you do that is that you give them opportunities to discover the contextual differences between the real life situation and the game situation. In After the Fall, the context is you're in a post-apocalyptic environment and resources are poorly distributed because it's a radioactive wasteland out there and we can't get to the resources. Whereas in our real world, capitalism is problem. But ultimately, we don't actually have that level of scarcity. And so what you can do is, what that's valuable for is reframing the political questions and the philosophical questions according to context. By pointing out, hey, this is what your fear of refugees is based on, but that fear, the basis which that fear is founded on, is not real outside of this imagined context. That is where you start to be able to move things forward. The usefulness of portrayal in a portrayal of negative things, as particularly in non-endorsement, is in terms of telling an ethical story in a LARP. The usefulness of it is about it's essentially the same as being the counterexample in a debating team. When you're debating, why smoking should be banned in primary school, someone's got to be there countering all of the reasons why smoking should be banned. You need a counterpoint. By the same point, any well-written essay or academic piece is going to address counterexamples. It's important to know what those are, the usefulness of portrayal of, say, right-wing talking points accurately in context, and saying, this is what scarcity looks like. This is when it's okay to worry about overpopulation and under-resources. This is not a situation that we're in now. That final point is what's really, really important. You're giving the players the opportunity to come back to reality and go, oh, it's different. I don't have a sword on my hip. There aren't monsters at the gate. I don't have to wear a differentiating piece of clothing that is analogous to that worn by the Jews in Nazi Germany. Having that difference be as unsubtle as possible helps translate, helps lead your horses to their water, and increase the likelihood that they will drink from the lesson which you seek to force down their throats.
Something that worked really well for us in Chesterwick, which obviously is not possible in a large-scale game, was the fact that, yes, we were exploring sexism, we were playing some very bad characters, we were making people very uncomfortable, but we were only doing it with 15 people. And we had a very robust code of conduct for anyone who was looking to join Chesterwick. We had a vetting system to make sure that everyone who made it into our warband basically aligned with the rest of us on the political spectrum regarding human rights and that kind of stuff. So we knew for a fact that there was no one who was joining our warband so that they could be sexist and racist and discriminate against people for fun. Everyone who was going into it would read a document that was basically like, this is our project scope. These are all the themes that we're going to be exploring in Chesterwick. These are the themes that are absolutely not appropriate under any circumstances in any of your role play. Here's an example of in-character sexism that is appropriate. Here's an example of in-character sexism that is inappropriate. For example, it's okay to say to someone else in the warband, or to say to my character, when Kieran would say, you'd say, oh, shut up, wife, stuff like that. It would be like, this is acceptable because it's consenting between these two characters. We've talked about it beforehand. It's okay. It's not acceptable for you to go up to someone who is not in our warband and basically tell them to shut up because they're a woman. So we had clear examples of how to keep that, first of all, within the warband, and how you could basically portray it in a performative sense. So you're not necessarily pulling people into our sexist world without them consenting to it. So we just basically gave people a lot of examples about what was acceptable, what was not acceptable, and then an out-of-character code of conduct about how you're expected to treat people, how you're expected to act around camp, how you're expected to act on Friday nights and just at social gatherings. And basically everyone had to sign it before they came into the warband. And really, because of that, we encountered very few issues, because the second we would encounter an issue, it would just be like, oh, hey, you violated number 4. How do you feel about that? Why did you do that? It was an accident. Cool. Let's talk about how we can make sure you don't do that in the future. It wasn't an accident. Great. Perhaps you're interested in joining another warband that isn't investigating such serious themes through a role play. And because we made those expectations really clear, I felt like we equipped people to be able to play characters like that and how to be able to do it without going over the top and ruining other people's play. And I think it's much harder to do that, like, for example, Rob, in your game, because yes, you have control over your NPCs and stuff like that. But I imagine, you guys have done an amazing job at doing exactly what I'm saying, basically, like having clear expectations and a code of conduct and giving people examples of how they should act. But I imagine there is that level of it being a little bit more uncontrollable because you just have a far larger player base and you're not writing their characters for them. I imagine it'd be, yeah.
It's something that we have to be much more reactive to in our larger game. For reference watchers at home, there's 100-ish players and 20, 30, 40 NPCs and other miscellaneous crew. So basically we have to rely on reports of people saying, this person's being problematic, this person's being problematic, this person's being problematic. But what's the point I want to make here? Yeah, we really have to be reactive, but it's also important to note that you can't be too strict. If Black Powder kicked out everyone about whom there'd be a complaint, I think like Rory Hill would still be playing and no one else. It would just be like Jess, Paul, and some shadow puppets for him. Like everyone is a little bit problematic. Nobody likes everyone perfectly. Nobody is perfect. And also referring like you can't just preach to the choir as well. So you have to like there's no point teaching lessons to people who are unreceptive, like straight up white supremacists who are using your game as a fantasy for murdering black people. But also like you can't kick out all the casual racists because in this country that's a thing. That's a thing that just happens.
So many.
Yeah, like but on any metric, nobody's perfect. And I genuinely mean it. There would be like 5 people left if we had kicked out everyone about whom there'd been some kind of complaint. You can't expect your player base to be absolutely 100% perfect all the time. You can't hold them to superhuman standards. You can hold your organizers to superhuman standards because we have to be better and we're responsible for the well-being of everyone around us who's in our game. So, if you discover that one of your organizers is secretly a white supremacist, stop running games with them, or a sexual predator or whatever. It's important that you hold your player base to some standards, such as those last 2. But it's also important, even if you're running a very strongly ethical game, that sometimes other expectations have to come first. Like we're at Black Powder, we're running a game which is fundamentally about scarcity, conflict, clash of cultures, imperialism, racism. If people were coming to a game unable to do that, to do those things in any capacity, like I said before, if everyone comes to Black Powder and cooperates, the game stops. It's a broken game. If everyone comes to Black Powder and doesn't do imperialism or racism, the game gets weird. And it becomes weird in a sort of erasive way. It's another point in favor of, portrayal is not endorsement. Ignoring something is erasure, which is the other side, and that's bad. And it's like, for example, the Uruk in Black Powder are orcs. There is a really good reason for that. A lot of people have said, why are you making the colonial victims in your game literally another race of people? Well, here's the answer. The answer is that we had a few choices. One was to run a colonial game where there were no native peoples. Yeah, Terranolius. Awesome. Cool. No, not doing that. Another was to run a game where half of the player base was getting to do blackface every event. No bueno. Another option would be to do a game where there were some analogous but rewritten local cultures, which were like noble savages, maybe.
Ugh.
But still, and look, so what we did was we said, look, orcs have a really, really interesting history in terms of fantasy literature. They also have a really strong redemptive arc. There's a lot of people who want to play orcs, like half of the World of Warcraft PvP community. Orcs have changed their perception in a bunch of different ways over history, and so having our native peoples in the new world of Black Powder be orcs means that we get to pick up a whole bunch of intertextual baggage and pop them on there as a metaphor and an analogy for the various ways in which imperialist cultures have interacted with native peoples throughout the world in our own history. And it's still not an option that... Still not...
Yeah, it's not ideal.
You can't not put natives in a game about colonialism. You have to do something. So what we did was we looked for the best possible option, and the option which would come with the most meta-narrative material to help players interact with the game in the way that we wanted them to. So contextually just as best as we can. Yeah.
Well, I actually think, and I mean, this is sort of like weird, might be weird, but it's like, because I don't know if there are any, within Australia, I don't know if there are any sort of Indigenous writers in the LARP community. And even if, you had someone like that on board, I don't know how they would react or respond, if it was like, would you be comfortable including something that's more in line with your own culture's experience, or would you want a degree of separation from that? But I mean, that would be a perspective on that I'd be really interested in hearing from. But obviously, it's hard to get that because I don't like the LARP community is overwhelmingly white, and I don't know if there's anyone sort of with an Indigenous background who's involved in writing or creating or even playing LARP in Victoria.
But even then, like, at the same time, even if like the Black Powder crew theoretically went out and sourced someone to write
it's
that.
okay because my black friend says
fine. And then you've got all these white players doing it, and it's like, oh no.
Yeah, at the same time as well, then you've like placed this responsibility for them to become this spokesperson
it's like,
for all of racism.
You wheel them out whenever someone gets and that's the thing. And it's like again, and that's why I'd want to hear their perspective, but I don't think it's short of an entirely Indigenous creative team creating a game specifically to explore that, and then I don't know how you get that to work.
Yeah, so honestly, I just kind of
this does not mean that these games shouldn't sort of exist, but it does mean that there is some careful, thoughtful, and very researched, purposeful ways to get this message, to get any message across this.
And it's why it's all right. It's why I when writing for the Uruk and human conflicts, I look to examples from Europe of like the conquest of the Celts by Caesar, or Roman arrivals in Europe, or Vikings is one of the big thematically what we've used is Vikings. So there's a lot of white guilt there, but basically I feel ultimately as long as the message is white people bad, then we could probably get away with it. But improving on that is something that I mean to do and would like to do and would like to see in other LARPs as well. Consulting with affected minority or autonomous groups is a really important thing to do when writing your LARP, and I wish I had done more of it.
Yeah.
I highly recommend getting in touch with Kiwi LARP rights. There are a lot of Indigenous LARP rights and players in New Zealand.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And also, I would be so interested to talk to a lot more New Zealand players about their sort of cultural space when they especially if they do explore those notions. Do you have any sort of experience with New Zealanders exploring that?
I mean, the first campaign game I ever played, Tion, did have an Indigenous race that, so far as I'm aware, were roughly inspired by Maori mythology. I'm not quite educated enough to speak about any of it in depth, but I mean, I don't know if you guys have been to New Zealand, but just Indigenous culture is embedded in basically everything there. It's really strong.
Way more present.
And to the extent that I didn't even notice how present it was until I moved to Australia, and I was horrified at how absent it was.
Yeah, well, because even the history between English colonizers and the Maori is really fucked for the Maori, because again, it was that thing where it's they did sign treaties and stuff with the British, which the Australian Indigenous people didn't, and they still got fucked out of them because they were dealing with the world's most powerful colonial empire. But yeah, it does have much more of a presence in New Zealand, which was something I found, because I came from Australia, went to New Zealand, and I was like, holy shit, there's so much more of a
bilingual presence. Road signs.
Yeah.
It's on the road signs. Te Reo's on it. It's Yeah, compared to Australia, it's pretty shameful when you come back here.
Yeah. So it's wild, and because
As it
it's
should
like
be.
Australia has tried so hard to bury that history, or like bury the bad parts, and I think a lot of white Australians especially try to pretend like it's fine now, and it's not fine. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's something I would definitely love to hear more from people within Australia. But I again, I have no idea if there's any sort of Indigenous Australians involved in LARP creation or anything like that, or if they even want to be. Like,
just also very quickly as well, as an aside, something that's strange that I've learned now that I'm in isolation and I've done the inevitable thing of joining TikTok. There is actually a large TikTok Indigenous community. It's
Cool.
I was like, these guys are content creators and they're like killing it. And like, it's so cool that there's like this fresh platform for Indigenous Australians to be like fully creative on and like express comedy or parts of their lives and culture. And, you know, it's really, really interesting and also really, really cool. And like, yeah, I think that where that can be relevant to why there aren't more spaces in LARP for Indigenous Australians. I think that, and Madeline, maybe you can sort of relate to this, but for me, when I joined Sawcraft or when I joined LARP in general, I felt like if there weren't women in a warband when I was looking to join a warband or join a group, I would think, is there a reason that there's no one else in this space? And I would immediately sort of be like, I'm not really interested in being there, because obviously if there's no one in that space, that's probably because there's no room for them. And so I felt like, you know, immediately looking at it from the outside, I'm like, there's actually no room for me in that space. There's no room for me in that community. And I think that sometimes, it can be difficult to try and create those spaces for people. I know that Falazrai, or should I say the Silverglade, has a large queer space because there are already queer people in that space, and thus they attract more queer people. And so they've got a large community of predominantly queer people who understand and interact with each other and can sort of really relate to each other and each other's experiences. They can hang out very like freely, knowing that they're going to be safe in that space and the people that they hang out with.
Well, I mean, the easiest way to attract people to your game who are minorities is to take people who are like them and put them in a position of power and say to yourself, do I need to speak right now, or can I let this person actually give me their opinion and speak instead of me? I think like it's basically because it's an action, because you're not just talking about being inclusive, you're showing you're inclusive because, you know, you're putting a woman on your board, and instead of talking over her, you're letting her actually speak. So you're not just saying, look, we have a token woman that we've put on our organizing board. You're also saying we have a woman, or we have multiple women, and we respect their opinions and we allow them to make decisions and speak about them. Because I don't think it's enough just to have kind of token people in your organization. I think they also need to be in speaking roles and making choices, and that needs to be shown. And so it's the same when it comes to joining a warband. If there is a woman in a position of power in the warband, or if there are just any women in the warband who appear happy, you're kind of like, there I am. Good. Okay, I know I can go there because Obviously, they haven't scared away those people yet, so it can't be that bad. Because I totally agree with you. That's one of the first things I started looking to when I started LARPing, because like 10 years ago, especially, it was such a male dominated hobby. And especially, I mean, using swordcraft as an example, it's also a combat sport. So it has that added level of not only is this a part of the geek community, which, you know, has a history of being hostile towards women, it's also a sport. So it's kind of got both of those there. And I think that naturally we all we want to fit in somewhere. And if we see someone else who's similar to us there, we're going to feel more likely that we're going to fit in. And then I guess putting people in positions of leadership, you know, it just goes up the next level, because it's not just they exist, it's we respect them, which is even more important.
Absolutely. I think that it's not just this like pedestal sort of action that we're doing. It's not this I remember reading somewhere once where someone was talking about Indigenous culture and how like it's portrayed in museums and in art, like all the way that the Western side of Australia's sort of culture views Aboriginal culture as well, is that they view it as history. Like it's something that's it's in the past and it's already been done. Like therefore, like if we put it behind glass, it's dead. And so we view it in a filter of this has already happened, it's already been finished, and we don't have to think about it too much anymore. It's something that we can just like be like, look, aren't we progressive? Cool. Moving on.
Yeah, another thing sort of with games as well is there's this, and you see it a lot in historical discourse on YouTube especially, is this idea that all civilizations started at the same origin point and were following the same tech tree. And because some civilizations reached different points on that tech tree first for whatever reason, that civilization was more developed than another one, which is a sort of very gamified way of looking at it, because games like Civilization especially have sort of enshrined that. And this is a huge problem, because you look at, you know, something like Mesoamerican cultures are a really good example for this. Like both the Inca and the Maya were doing agriculture in really, really agriculturally hostile places. Like the Maya civilization was literally on this huge fucking block of limestone, so it's really alkaline soil, it's like garbage quality. And then the Inca were in the mountains where the soil's really thin and rocky, and both had incredibly like highly like high-tech land management practices and systems that allowed them to do agriculture on like a scale and like level of efficiency and productivity that the Europeans at the time just couldn't match. But like then they, you know, like the Inca didn't have the wheel, because why would you have that if you lived in the mountains? Like how is the wheel all that useful? And so, but like people look at that and they're like, oh, one culture's less advanced than the other. And you see this in games a lot, like especially in video games, this idea that like one culture is less advanced because it hasn't discovered a thing that this other culture has discovered, or they don't use this thing. But it's like even here in Australia, like people say, yeah, I mean, like it's tragic what happened, but like white people brought civilization, they brought all this technology and society and stuff like that, and it's like it erases and ignores all this other development that had happened in other areas that, you know, they were just fucking miles ahead of us on. And like, you know, I think especially in the wake of the fires, people are beginning to realize just how bad we are at this and how much knowledge we didn't only lose through erasing it, but actively worked to destroy as a culture and as part of the genocide. And, you know, games can do this as well, because when you sort of create a progression system, and you say, yeah, this is the way you progress, there's like, it's a tree, you go from one step to the other, to the other, to the other, and then you apply that to cultures, or you apply that to a race of people, or you apply that to a society of people, that has really harmful implications. Because if you say that, like, oh yeah, so the way a culture develops is first you develop agriculture, and then you develop living in a single place, and then you develop sort of like animal husbandry, and then you develop like, you know, the wheel, and then you develop fucking irrigation, and then you develop, and it's like, if you look at it in that very linear way, and basically you look at it in the way that sort of like East Asian and European civilizations developed, it's going to blind you to a lot of the progression and development that a lot of other countries made. Like, you know, just an example is like Australia, you know, is, you know, eucalypt trees are synonymous with Australia. Until human settlement, they were only like, I think 13 to 20% of the total forest makeup. And now, after like 40,000 years of human settlement or longer, like they formed 70% of the overall sort of forest makeup because of the massive scale land management practices that indigenous people underwent that basically allowed them to use the land in an extremely productive way for themselves, but also was done in such a way that the land was sustainable, that the ecology was sustainable. Like they survived some of the most like devastating drought periods in any of the continents bar Antarctica during like the Pliocene ice age. And then after 200 years of European settlement, we've completely fucked most of the drainage basins, most of the river systems, like so much of the soil. And it's like, again, because it's this view that one culture is further along this developmental path than the other. So we've assumed that the way we approach things is more advanced, and as a result, we've fucked everything up. And it's because we were so far behind in terms of just land management. And yeah, if you
Okay, cycling it back to gameplay.
the idea of progression and the idea of like, if you try and gamify cultural progression or cultural discovery or cultural advancement, you are going to run into these problems because basically all groups of humans develop at the same rate, sort of give or take how many people they have, because cultural development is basically people throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. But they're not all going towards the same destination point, and they're not all going in the same direction. And if you predicate these progression systems on the assumption that they are, or you think that there is an end goal that all human societies are trying to reach, you're already in like murky water. And the outcomes of the system that you're creating will be racist.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that you're discussing, Hayden, is basically the propensity of historians to grade civilizations on who would win a world war, because ultimately that's what all of that stuff leads to in terms of economic surplus and military capacity. And so if you as a LARP organizer write your progression system in a way that leads towards military conflict, then you are perpetuating those stereotypes and misguided ideological ideas. So even something as simple as your rules, your character development, they are part of the message. I think in a previous game we said everything that you as an organizer communicate to your players tells them about your game. It also tells them about your politics and the ethics. They're the same thing, everyone, by the way. Yeah. They're the same. So it's important to keep in mind in those that your systems will reinforce your message. So keep that.
Yeah, just to point out as well, Josiah has been throwing up some wonderful links about decolonization and Indigenous in the gaming field, and just decolonizing the digital and discussion in digital games using Civilization 5 as an example.
Civ 5 does that thing where it treats all cultural progression as the same, because it assumes every society is trying to reach the same endpoint.
And Kenyon, obviously lovely, Kenyon has also cited that something that I've noticed that LARPs can do better for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is paying respects to the land that they are playing on. It is a good step in both diversity and learning for organisers, so in briefings and intros to events. And as a note, I think it's like that really sort of highlights as well for you this acknowledgement and sort of really gives your player base a sort of understanding that this is a space for everyone, and including the people that we are trying to include in the space, because you are trying to be inclusive. And especially I know that for even Rob, for Black Powder Bloodlines, it almost unintentionally becomes another mechanic that you've designed, in which that you are sort of giving acknowledgement and paying respects to the original owners to the land. And by the way, remember that this is a game about colonialism, and please sort of explore that idea with respect, but also like with philosophical thought, I guess. Yeah,
it's actually worth explicitly pointing out that out of character things that you do also assists with clarifying, are you just giving people an excuse to do racism, or are you exploring the racism? Because when we say it's the 26th of April, happy Invasion Day, everyone, buy your tickets for Black Powder, and also think about that, that's a way of getting across that, no, this isn't just a game about going out and doing happy racism and genocide. This is a game about exploring the ideas, and you as a writer can go back and think about whatever messages it is that you're wanting to get across in your game, and finding out of character ticks to reinforce that message and signal, virtue signaling, and signal, this is our intent, this is the kind of people that we are, this is our motivation for running this event. No, it's not just about cosplaying as Nazis. Sorry, it's about saying that the machinery of war is a horrible thing. If, say, you were doing a 40k LARP, getting those messages across is super important out of character, because that reinforces your in-character messages.
Also,
just quickly as well, Josiah has also put in the Welcome to Country app into the stream chat.
I am stealing that.
Yeah, it looks really, really useful. Everyone get on that.
We're just past 2:30 as well.
All right, cool.
Thank you.
So I guess in a nutshell, representation just can't be performative. You need to, as Madeline was pointing out, you need to put people in positions of power. You need to pay heed to their opinions, their ideas, and because they are worthwhile and they deserve the space in the community if you wish to be an inclusive community, which I hope that you do. So I guess how can we wrap this up? How do we, when we are writing our art, because LARP can be art, LARP is art, and we're crafting our message, and we're building our player base. Like, how do we in a tight little TLDR, how do we start to think about those things in dot points?
Again, I'm going to draw this back to material outcomes are really important, and you need to look at what you are trying to say, what impact you want to have on your players, and what lessons you want your players to take away from the game. Because if you're like, all right, I don't necessarily want my players to take away any lessons from this game, I'm happy for them not to draw any allegory from this game off about anything, that's fine. But then you need to look at, well, is there anything else that your game is inadvertently communicating that may be something you don't want to be communicating? So looking at both sides of that coin, what do you actively want to be communicating, and what are you communicating that you don't want to be communicating? Those are both important to look at.
Josiah just pointed out really... Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, you go, it's okay.
One principle of ethical design each, or a guiding ethical question that we can take away / use as budding designers. I assume that's what you were going to touch on. Yes. Please.
Yeah, mine's pretty short. It's, if you're exploring difficult concepts through your LARP, you need to be asking yourself if you trust your players enough to explore those. And if you don't, you need to be asking yourself why and what you screwed up and what you can fix to make sure you trust the people playing your game.
I think my takeaway or like principle for ethical design would be, oh no, I lost it. All right, so a different one. Something to keep in mind about why you might write ethics into your LARP is that in order to change the world, you have to change people. And in order to change people, there are two methods, and those are violence or argument. And LARP is one of the most powerful potential tools in the toolkit of argument. And so if you want to help change the world and you're a LARPer, then it is worth putting, even if it's not a game about, it's not a political game, quote unquote, everything is political. So remember that the messages that you put in will be the messages that people take away. So think about them and think about the kind of world that you want to live in outside of your game, and just sprinkle some ethical dust in there, and use the concepts and ideas that we've talked about, or talk to us about how to implement them, because hopefully you'll make the world a better place.
I think also narrative is a good synonym to use for argument there, because I think people are more persuaded by narrative than they are by argument most of the time.
Yeah. Aye.
Yeah, I guess that sort of touches on what I was going to sort of come at it with, which is the how effective the emotionality behind the narrative can be in influencing how your players feel. Because a lot of the time, as we've said in previous streams, a lot of sort of movements are based in, or change is based in emotion of that change, or of the story, of the narrative, and so really trying to connect with how you're making your players feel through mechanic, through the design is a really important thing to think about. And I mean, Rob said it pretty succinctly, like thinking about the world that you want your players to play in, or thinking about the world that you want your players to think about living in, really leads them to asking questions to themselves about how they want things to be. And that is the leading the horse to the water moment, I guess. Cool. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, I think on that note, in the terms of narrative is more persuasive than argument, analogies and metaphors can work like Trojan horses, and they are really persuasive, especially if people aren't expecting them. So that is a thing you can use for both good or evil, but they can also happen by accident. And so, again, you need to pay attention to what your game is doing, because there will be times when your game has a thing where someone's like, oh, this thing is like other thing, when it may not be, or it may not have been apparent to you. So that's always worth looking at as well.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you to everyone for tuning in, and hanging out with us, and asking questions, and the amazing links that everyone's been providing. Shout out to Josiah. Thank you very much. What a good man. Thank you to you guys for joining in on this discussion. This has been incredibly enlightening and very, very insightful. You're all very deeply clever people, and I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to talk on this topic. I would do it for hours if I could. If I could just trap you in my house for like 6 hours, I'd do it. But thank you so much. And yeah, I really, really appreciate it. I guess the next thing that we are going to be speaking on, I'll just quickly
Thank
pull
you,
that up.
Des.
Thank you. The next thing that we're going to be speaking on is risk and reward, intelligent collaborators, aka your players. We talk about the importance of your player base and the philosophy of creating with them, which kind of like sits along this pretty amazingly. And yeah, I can't wait to sort of talk about that and see where we go with that. That's likely to be on Monday at 6 p.m. So yeah, I can't wait to get into that and start unpacking it. But thank you, and thank you to you guys, and I guess have a really lovely day. We're gonna sign off now.
All right. See you later, everyone. Remember, the vast majority of Australians don't actually own any property, and they're either paying off their rent or a mortgage. So if there was mass seizure of land and return to the Indigenous people, it wouldn't actually affect anyone because they'd just be paying off the rent or mortgage to that person. Bye!